Parliament was back, as I said, today, and with the PM out of the country, it was Acting Prime Minister Richard Marles and the Treasurer Jim Chalmers taking the lead in question time. Regular viewers of the program will know I often remind people that just like anyone with a mortgage, governments too pay interest on any borrowings. And when you're borrowing hundreds of billions of dollars, that interest bill racks up. It was only a year or so ago that all the so-called experts said, don't worry about borrowing, money's cheap. But as I said then, and I'll caution again, it might be cheap, but when rates move, the interest on it's not cheap at all. And that's, of course, where we are today with confirmation that Australia's interest bill on our national borrowings is likely to add at least $120 billion to what we were told it would cost us back in March with Josh Frydenberg's last budget. Joining me now to discuss this and more, political editor at the Australian Financial Review, Phil Coorey. Phil, thank you for coming on the program. Jim Chalmers, pretty pessimistic about the current economic outlook. I think he's right to be pessimistic. It's certainly pessimistic in Europe. Debt's set to hit $1 trillion within 2 years. We saw that interest bill hike up as well. But we've still got a lot of Labor spending on the table. How do they reconcile the spending given how crook things are?
Good evening, Peter. I think there's been a sort of change of heart inside the government, since they've got onto the Treasury benches and seen firsthand for themselves, the ocean of red ink and how hard it's going to be to sort of start getting it under control. So they've got to implement the policies they took to the election, the promises. So the main one is the extra $5.5 billion they're going to spend on childcare, and they're going to put that legislation in tomorrow. If you remember, Peter, going into the election, Labor promised a budget bottom line would be about $8.5 billion worse off than the coalition's over 4 years. I don't think there's any appetite now inside the government to go beyond that. And we've seen this change of language from the Treasurer. Remember, before the election, he was sort of arguing it's not how much you spend, it's the quality of the spend. Remember the bang for your buck speeches, like this sort of magic theory that if you spent money on stuff that generated economic activity, it'd somehow pay for itself. He's now shut the door on that type of thinking. So I think the best example you can sort of see in terms of, where they're at is the decision which is going to come into effect at midnight on Wednesday not to continue with the petrol excise reduction. That would be the easiest and most populist thing to do. But they're going to bite the bullet and put 25 cents a litre back on petrol, and I think that sort of shows internally inside the government at least there's a discipline starting to form.
Yeah, I read it the same way, Phil. It would be very easy to roll over on that decision, but they know then they'd just be putting it off for another quarter. So I think that tells you they realise it's grim. I've spent a lot of the last month or so overseas, particularly in and around Europe. It's hard to find anyone who's other than pessimistic about where they're headed going into energy security issues over winter. We see the same sort of concerns, particularly also in the United States. What's the general mood, do you think, about the Australian economy? Do you think we're going to see a Fed income budget from the Treasurer in October, knowing that, our cycle, our 3-year election cycle, you get one chance to cut hard or to reset things in your first budget. If you don't do it then, you're unlikely to do it.
Yeah, look, the sort of view on the economy itself, the domestic economy compared to everyone else's, is relatively upbeat, and relatively being the key word there. At this stage, there's still an expectation we wouldn't go into recession, whereas there's now a large expectation the bigger economies, the US and the British and the Europeans will. But again, if they do that, that drags us all down. So, as sort of resilient or as robust as we might be, we can only, go so far before we get weighed down by the rest of the world. But as for the budget, Peter, this is an October budget. It's not a normal May budget. So as Jim Chalmers said last week, it's largely a reconciliation exercise. It's essentially going to update us on the state of the books. It'll find the money to pay for those promises like childcare that I mentioned earlier. And they will cut as hard as they can, but not, I don't think it'll be huge. I think it'll be more low-hanging fruit, stuff. Run the ruler through a lot of those line-by-line items left over from the last government, especially some of the grants programs. That big, that ill-defined splurge of cash that the Nationals got for the bush in return for net zero, things like that. There'll be a few billion in there, but as the Treasurer sort of also said, the real sort of softening up exercise for the next election begins early next year. There'll be a budget again in May, and that's when they're going to. But before that, or around the same time, they're going to do another one of those intergenerational reports. Now they're only meant to be done every 5 years. They sort of project out 40 years and tell us how horrendously expensive everything's going to be in 40 years' time. They're going to do another one just 2 years after the last one. So they're trying to get us all sort of seized of the size of the task ahead. Then, as Chalmers has pretty much confirmed, they're going to start building a mandate, if you like, for the next election. They won't be able to break promises this side of the election, Peter, and bring in new taxes or cut things they said they're not going to cut, but I think they're going to ask for a fair bit going to the next election, and they really need 2 years to build that case.
I mean, the difficulty is, Phil, having sat there in that horror budget of 2014-15, which, government was highly critical, was criticised for, you have to get into the health and welfare areas if you're going to make sustained, decent savings longer term, right? And you have to start taking things off people, which is never politically popular. For the life of me, I can't see why on this issue of childcare that's coming into the Parliament this week, why on earth they are still persisting with taxpayers' subsidies for households that earn over $530,000 a year. Now tell me, why are taxpayers funding the childcare of someone on $500,000?
There's a few people in Labor asking the same question, but the Prime Minister argues it's not a welfare measure, Peter, it's a productivity measure, and it shouldn't be limited by income. There's a lot of these inconsistencies around the building at the moment. I mean, like there's pressure on Labor coming, led by the Greens, to abolish the state 3 tax cuts, and they run around with this line today saying, why should politicians and billionaires get a tax cut? But the Greens are proposing politicians and billionaires get up to $50,000 a year in paid parental leave. So it's all about what one party thinks is more important than the other. And you would remember, from your days on the other side, the paid parental leave that Tony Abbott was pushing. He now looks like a visionary. It's almost identical to the one of the ACTU and the Greens and Twiggy, Forrest and all else are calling for now.
They could have had it 10 years ago. They had.
You could have had it. Could have done a deal.
They could have had it 10 years ago, but it was Tony Abbott, so.
Yeah,
sorry,
exactly
mate, it was
right.
Tony Abbott, so they were never going to support it.
That's right, and as someone mentioned that to me the other day, that was the reason why the Greens didn't actually do the deal at the time. So, so everything comes around, goes around, Peter. But there's a lot of inconsistency around this building at the moment about priorities. But back to what you're saying about the 14 budget and so forth, you're right. As Jim Chalmers, he's nominated the 5 biggest areas of expenditure: health, aged care, defence, NDIS, and the debt payment, the interest payments on debt. And I think the big one really is the NDIS. We were told that was going to cost $25 billion a year. It's now forecast to hit $60 billion a year by 2030. It's a very important program. It looks after our most vulnerable people, but unless its design flaws and its rorts and its over-servicing are reined in, that thing's going to disappear. And I also think it's a bit unfair to ask voters going into the next election to pay more or do with less to pay for these things if you're not at the same time making a reasonable effort to rein in the costs. I don't think it's fair to ask people to pay more taxes for something that's you shouldn't be paying for things that are poorly administered, poorly legislated, and are just wasting money. It's income. If they want to build support, they have to show they're trying to save money too.
Hey, you're a canny political analyst. I'll get your take on this. I know it's not your patch necessarily, but as I said, you've been around a while. Look at Victoria, 6 lockdowns, state debt that's now bigger than New South Wales, Queensland and Tasmania combined. But your sister newspaper, The Age, had a Resolve poll that said the Premier will be comfortably returned. Labor's on a whopping primary of 42%. The Coalition completely unwinnable on 28%. Greens up 12%. Independents also on a 12% take. I think everyone around the country is scratching their head when they look at what Victoria's gone through over the last couple of years. Why is it, do you think?
I don't know, Pete. I gave up trying to understand that down there a while ago. My only sort of view is, politics is always a binary proposition. When you talk about one side, it brings the other side into play. And I think the Liberals down there have been so poor for so long, they just haven't provided that alternative people are looking for. But that doesn't explain all of it. There's just this sort of, I don't know what it is down there, but they just think they did better than everyone else when they didn't. And but they, you know what it's like with the I Stand With Dan crowd. It is what it is. Yeah.
It is what it is. I certainly know that crowd. They come after me on a regular basis, but we enjoy the sport. Phil Coorey, thank you for your time.